The sound was not human. It was not animal. It was the sound of physics failing. January 12th, 1888. 4:15 p.m., Dakota Territory. The air temperature is 22 degrees below zero. The wind chill is approaching 60 below. But the number that matters right now is not the temperature. It is the drag coefficient. Consider the standard American homestead. A 12 by 12 box, milled pine, tar paper, 4 walls meeting at 90-degree angles, a roof pitched at 45 degrees. It is the shape of civilization. It is the shape of the East, and in this wind, it is a structural suicide note. Inside the Miller homestead, the laws of aerodynamics are tearing the world apart. The wind, traveling at 70 miles per hour, hits the flat north face of the house. It cannot go through. It cannot easily go around, so it stops. When air stops moving, its pressure spikes. This is the stagnation point. Thousands of pounds of invisible force are currently pushing against the north wall, bending the green timber, popping the iron nails, bowing the structure inward like a crushed lung. But the real danger is on the other side. As the wind screams around the sharp, square corners of the house, it accelerates. It speeds up. And as Bernoulli's principle dictates, when air speeds up, pressure drops. The Miller house is caught in a lethal vice. High pressure is crushing the front. A massive vacuum is sucking at the back and the roof. The house is trying to explode and implode simultaneously. The roof joists are screaming. The tar paper is ripping away in long black ribbons that vanish into the white void before they even hit the ground. Inside, the family is huddled under a table, listening to their shelter disintegrate. They built a square in a world that demands a curve. 300 yards to the west, the physics are different. There is a shape rising from the prairie floor. It has no corners. It has no flat surfaces. It is a low, brooding cylinder of earth, capped with a conical hat of woven willow and grass. The wind hits this structure and finds no purchase. It encounters a curve. Instead of slamming into a flat wall and stagnating, the air adheres to the surface. It flows. It wraps around the arc of the wall, hugging the shape, slipping past with minimal turbulence. The drag coefficient here is less than half that of the square house. Inside, the flame of a tallow candle stands perfectly still. Sarah Kowalsski sits on a crate made of rough-hewn cottonwood. She is 15 years old. She is wearing 3 layers of wool and a shawl she knitted herself, but her hands are bare. They are wrapped around a tin cup of hot water and chicory. She is not under a table. She is not praying for the roof to hold. She is simply waiting. She can hear the storm. It sounds different here. It doesn't sound like a freight train collision. It sounds like a river rushing over a smooth stone, a deep, continuous hum. The structure around her, 20 tons of root-bound earth, is not fighting the wind. It is part of the wind. The experts, the men with the surveying equipment and the carpentry manuals, the men who laughed at her for 6 months, are currently freezing to death in their collapsing boxes. They called her a savage. They said she was digging a tomb. They said a girl could not understand the engineering of a home. They were right. She didn't understand the engineering of a home. She understood the engineering of a boulder. She understood that in the face of absolute violence, the only way to survive is to refuse to fight. This is the story of how a castaway child looked at the architecture of the natural world, ignored the wisdom of the industrial age, and built the only thing that could survive the great white hurricane. To understand why a 15-year-old girl was living alone in a dirt cylinder on the edge of the known world, you have to understand the economics of the 1880s frontier. It was a place where human value was measured in muscle mass and caloric output. Sarah was a surplus calculation. Her stepfather, a man named Elias, who had buried 2 wives and 3 farms in Ohio before moving west, looked at the ledger and made a choice. It was August. The harvest was coming. He had 5 children of his own, hungry, loud, and demanding. Sarah was the daughter of his previous wife, a Polish immigrant who had died of the fever the year before. Sarah was quiet. She was odd. She spent too much time looking at the ground, at the way ants built their hills, at the way water moved through the creek. She didn't fit the square hole of the family. The conversation happened on a Tuesday. It was not dramatic. There was no shouting. Elias simply put a piece of paper on the table. It was a claim deed. 160 acres of nothing, 10 miles west. Technically, it belonged to Sarah's mother. Technically, it was Sarah's inheritance. Practically, it was a death sentence. "You have 2 choices," Elias said, not looking her in the eye. "There is a widower in Fargo, Mr. Henderson. He needs a wife to cook and clean. He is 50. He has agreed to take you. Or you take this paper. You take the mule, you take a sack of corn, and you go prove up the claim." He expected her to cry. He expected her to choose the widower. It was the only logical choice for a girl with no skills, no money, and no protection. Sarah looked at the paper. She looked at the stepfather who had never spoken a kind word to her. She looked at the heavy iron stove that she had polished every morning for 4 years. "I will take the mule," she said. She left an hour later. She took Bessie, a mule with a swayback and a bad temper. She took a spade with a cracked handle. She took a 50-pound sack of cornmeal, a bag of dried beans, a small axe, a Bible she couldn't read but kept for the paper, and her father's old Civil War blanket. She walked 10 miles into the ocean. That is what the prairie is. It is not land. It is a sea of grass, rolling and heaving in the wind, stretching to a horizon that curves away from you. There are no trees. There are no landmarks. If you walk in a straight line for 3 days, you will see exactly the same thing you saw on the first morning. The psychological crushing weight of the open plains drove men mad. They called it prairie madness. The silence is so absolute that you can hear your own heart beating in your ears. You can hear the blood rushing in your veins. Sarah arrived at her claim in the late afternoon. It was a quarter section of waist-high switchgrass and bluestem. There was a small ravine cutting through the northwest corner, a scar in the earth where water ran in the spring. She tied Bessie to a stake. She stood in the center of her inheritance. She had no lumber. She had no nails. She had no money to buy them. The railhead was a day's ride away, and lumber cost $20 per 1,000 board feet. She had 40 cents. She lay down in the grass that first night, wrapped in the blanket. The wind blew over her. She watched the stars, terrifyingly bright and cold. She knew that in 3 months, the frost would come. If she was not under a roof by then, she would die. It was a simple binary equation: build or freeze. Most settlers solved this problem with the claim shanty. A quick, ugly shack made of single-wall boards, barely windproof, freezing in winter, an oven in summer. But to build a shanty, you needed the supply chain. You needed the economy. Sarah had resigned from the economy. She went to the ravine the next morning to look for water. She found the creek bed, mostly dry, a trickle of mud. And she found the stone. It was a granite erratic, dropped by a glacier 10,000 years ago. It was round, polished smooth by eons of wind and water. It sat in the middle of the channel. Sarah watched a sudden gust of wind ripple through the ravine. It hit the square cut of the bank, tearing clumps of dirt loose, eroding the edge. But when the wind hit the round stone, it parted. It flowed over the curve. The grass directly behind the stone was still. The stone created a shadow, not of darkness, but of calm. She remembered her grandmother, back in the old country, in the Tatra Mountains. She remembered stories of the Koliba, the huts of the shepherds. They were not squares, they were rounds, cones of timber and stone. Why? Because the wind in the mountains has no mercy. The wind hates a flat wall. The wind wants to tear down anything that stands up to it. But the circle is humble. The circle bows, the circle deflects. Sarah walked back to the high ground. She took a piece of rope from the mule's harness. She drove a stake into the ground. She tied the rope to the stake. She walked out 10 feet, the length of the rope, and she began to walk. She dragged her heel through the tough sod, cutting a perfect circle in the earth with a 20-foot diameter. She did not measure corners. She did not look for a plumb line. She defined her world by a center point and a radius. This was the moment of divergence. This was the moment she stopped being a settler and started being a creature of the environment. The first skeptic arrived 3 days later. It was inevitable. The prairie is empty, but it is not private. Smoke rises, dust travels. Mr. Henderson, not the suitor, but the owner of the lumberyard in town, came riding out to check on potential customers. He was a man of commerce. He saw the prairie as a ledger. Every acre was a potential wheat field. Every settler was a potential debtor. He pulled his buggy up to where Sarah was working. She was waist-deep in a hole. She had decided to dig down before she built up. This was the first instinct of the survivalist. Utilize the thermal mass of the earth. The ground temperature below the frost line sits at a constant 50 degrees year-round. If you dig down, you are halfway to being warm. Henderson looked at the circular trench. He looked at the girl, covered in black mud, hacking at the roots. "You're digging a grave, girl," he said. He didn't mean it metaphorically. He stepped down from the buggy, lighting a pipe. "You can't frame a house like that. I've got pine shiplap in the yard. I can let you have it on credit. 10% interest. You can have a 12 by 16 up in 2 days. Standard frame, resale value." Sarah wiped the sweat from her eyes. "I have no money for the payment," she said. "That's why it's credit." Henderson laughed. "You pay me when you harvest the wheat." "I have no plow for the wheat," she said. "I am building with what is here." Henderson scoffed. "Sod? You're building a soddy? That's desperate, even for out here. But a round one? That's foolishness. How you gonna put a roof on a circle? You need a ridge beam. You need gables. Physics, girl. You can't cheat geometry." He was the pragmatist. He believed that the only way to do things was the way they were done in the catalog. The square house was efficient to manufacture, easy to ship, and easy to sell. Therefore, it was correct. He couldn't see that the catalog was written for Ohio, not for the Dakota winds. He spat on the ground, shook his head, and rode off. He left her with the distinct feeling that she was failing a test she hadn't agreed to take. The second skeptic was the expert. 2 weeks later, the county surveyor came through. He was a young man, educated in the East, carrying a brass theodolite and a notebook full of logarithms. He was there to verify claim boundaries. He found Sarah laying the first course of sod bricks. She was using a technique she had invented on the fly. She wasn't stacking them straight up. She was stepping each layer in slightly, creating a batter, an inward slope. The surveyor adjusted his glasses. He was fascinated, but in the way a biologist is fascinated by a deformed specimen. "The structural integrity of a circular masonry wall depends on hoop stress," he lectured, not offering to help her lift the 50-pound block. "But you have no mortar. You are relying on friction and gravity. Without a rigid timber frame, the wind load will cause shear failure. A rectangle dissipates force through the corner posts. This is a monolithic instability." He pointed to the horizon. "Look at the Miller place. Look at the Swedish settlement. Rectangles, orthogonal lines. That is civilization. We impose order on nature. We don't mimic it. This looks like a beaver lodge. It's regression." Sarah didn't know what orthogonal meant, but she knew that when she leaned against her curved wall, it felt like it was leaning back, holding her up. She knew that the wind which was already blowing hard in October, whistled around her wall instead of thumping against it. "It holds the heat," Sarah said quietly. "It holds the damp," the surveyor corrected. "You'll have consumption by spring, if the roof doesn't crush you first." The third skeptic was the moralist. Mrs. Gable, the matriarch of the nearest settlement, arrived in a buggy with a parasol. She represented the social order. She represented the fear that if they didn't maintain the standards of the East, they would all revert to savagery. She didn't look at the walls. She looked at Sarah. She saw a 15-year-old girl with dirt under her fingernails, wearing men's boots, living in a hole in the ground. "It is not proper," Mrs. Gable said, her lips pursed. "A young woman, alone, living like an animal in a burrow. It shames us. It shames the community. We are trying to build a town, Sarah. We are trying to bring culture here, and you are building a mud hut." She offered Sarah a job as a maid. "You can live in our attic. You will be warm. You will be clean. You can abandon this project." It was a tempting offer: warmth, food, safety, but it meant surrender. It meant admitting that she was too weak, too stupid, too female to survive on her own land. Sarah looked at her round wall. It was waist-high now. It was ugly. It was hairy with grass roots. It was damp, but it was hers, and it was strong. "I will stay," Sarah said. Mrs. Gable sighed, the sigh of a woman washing her hands of a tragedy. "When the blizzard comes, Sarah, do not expect us to dig you out. You are choosing this." They all drove away. The pragmatist, the expert, the moralist. They left her alone with the physics. The construction of the house was a war of attrition between Sarah's spine and the root system of the prairie. The material was Nebraska marble, sod, but not just dirt. It was the top 4 inches of the prairie floor, a dense, tangled mat of buffalo grass roots. These roots were wire-tough, growing 3 feet deep, interlocking so tightly that you couldn't pull them apart with your hands. To harvest it, Sarah hitched Bessie to the plow. She couldn't cut a straight furrow because the mule was stubborn, so she cut curved lines. This turned out to be a blessing. The curved bricks fit the curved wall better. The sound of the plow was a constant rip, 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 like tearing heavy canvas. She cut the ribbons of sod into 2-foot lengths. Each block weighed about 50 pounds wet. Lift, twist, step, place, lift, twist, step, place. She did this 300 times a day. Her hands blistered until they looked like raw meat. Then they scabbed. Then they turned into leather. The dirt worked its way into her skin until she couldn't wash it out. She became part of the earth she was moving. The wall was 3 feet thick at the bottom. This was the thermal mass. 3 feet of earth has an R value that is technically low, but a thermal lag that is massive. It takes 12 hours for heat, or cold, to travel through 3 feet of dirt. This meant that the noon heat would reach the interior at midnight, and the midnight cold would reach the interior at noon. The wall was a battery. As the walls rose above her head, she had to solve the roof. The surveyor was right about one thing. You can't put a standard gable roof on a circle. There is no ridge to rest the rafters on. Sarah didn't use rafters. She went to the creek and cut green willow poles. She didn't have a saw to cut complex angles. She used the logic of the weave. She laid the first pole across the wall, but not through the center. She laid it slightly off-center, a chord in geometric terms. She laid the next pole across the first one, rotating slightly. The third across the second. She built a reciprocal frame. It was a spiral of timber. Every pole rested on the wall at one end, and on another pole at the other end. No single pole carried the weight. They shared it. As gravity pulled down on the roof, the poles locked tighter together. It was a self-supporting mandala. On top of the poles, she wove brush. On top of the brush, she piled loose hay. And on top of the hay, she laid a final layer of living sod, grass side up. When she finished in late November, the house looked less like a building and more like a hillock that had decided to grow a door. It was 20 feet across. The ceiling was low, barely 6 feet at the center. She fashioned a door from the crate wood and covered it with 2 layers of buffalo hide she had scavenged from a carcass left by hunters. She hung it on leather hinges. She stepped inside. The silence was instant. Outside, the November wind was already gusting to 40 miles per hour, rattling the dry grass. Inside, it was dead quiet. The thick walls absorbed the sound. The air was still. She lit her small stove, a cast-iron box she had salvaged. She fed it a twist of hay. The draft was perfect. The smoke curled up and out the vent pipe she had run through the center of the roof. Within an hour, the temperature inside rose to 60 degrees. Outside it was 20. She sat on her crate. Her back throbbed. Her hands were claws. But she was enclosed. The circle held her. There were no dark corners for shadows to hide in. The firelight washed smoothly over the curved walls. She had built a machine for survival. Now she just had to wait for the operator, nature, to turn the dial to maximum. December passed in a blur of grey days. The snow came, but it was light. The real test was the cold. The Miller family, in their square house, were burning coal. They had bought a ton of it on credit. But their house leaked. The wind pushed air through the clapboards. The heat stripped away from the uninsulated walls. They went to bed wearing their coats. They woke up with frost on their blankets. Sarah burned cats, twists of hay, and dried dung. She had no coal. She didn't need it. Her house was an insulator. Once the 3-foot walls absorbed the heat, they held it. She could let the fire die down at 10 p.m., and at 6 a.m. the water in her bucket would still be liquid. She watched the behavior of the wind. When snow blew past the Miller house, it piled up in massive drifts against the flat walls. The drifts grew until they covered the windows, blocking the light, then melted against the wood, rotting it. At Sarah's roundhouse, the wind accelerated around the curves. This acceleration, the Venturi effect, scoured the base of the walls clean. The snow didn't drift against her house. It was thrown clear, depositing in a long tail 10 yards downstream. Her windows remained clear. Her walls remained dry. She was living in an aerodynamic anomaly. Then came January. The morning of the 12th was deceptively warm. The January thaw. It was above freezing. The air felt heavy, wet, and strange. Sarah stepped outside. The sky was a peculiar color, a bruised, yellowish gray. The birds were not singing. The cattle in the distance were huddled together, facing northwest, their heads low. Animals know when the pressure drops. Humans forget. Sarah felt the hair on her arms stand up. It was static electricity. The tension in the atmosphere was building to a breaking point. She dragged Bessie the mule inside. This was a violation of Mrs. Gable's rules, livestock in the house. But Sarah knew that a mule left outside tonight would be a statue by morning. She brought in extra wood. She filled her water bucket. She checked the latch on the door. At 3 p.m. she saw it. It looked like a mountain range moving across the prairie. A rolling, boiling wall of black cloud extending from the ground to the heavens, moving at 50 miles an hour. It was swallowing the world. The temperature dropped 18 degrees in 3 minutes. Sarah closed the door and dropped the heavy wooden bar into place. The impact was not a noise. It was a physical blow. The entire planet seemed to shudder. This brings us back to the start. The 70 mm of wind, the ice dust, the total whiteout. Inside the square houses across the territory, panic set in. The wind found every gap. It blew out lanterns. It ripped open doors. Roofs began to lift. The leverage of the wind on the overhanging eaves of the gable roofs acted like a pry bar. At the Miller house, the nails groaned. John Miller was trying to hold the door shut with his shoulder. The wind was pulsing, hammering the structure. Thump, thump, crack. The structural floor of the square is the corner. The corner is a stress concentrator. Forces gather there. The wind pushing on the north wall transferred all its load to the east and west walls, trying to shear them sideways. The geometry was fighting itself. Sarah sat on the floor, leaning against the warm earth of her wall. Bessie stood in the center, ears twitching, but calm. The wind screamed over the reciprocal roof. The spiral shape, low and conical, acted like a spoiler on a race car. It created downforce. The harder the wind blew, the harder it pressed the roof down onto the walls. The structure got stronger as the storm got worse. There was no vibration. The sod absorbed the energy. The round shape shed the load. Sarah closed her eyes. She imagined the wind as water, flowing around her stone. She was the stone. Suddenly, a sound cut through the muffled roar. A scratching, a desperate, frantic thumping on the door. Sarah leapt up. No one should be out there. To be out there was death. She lifted the bar. The wind tore the door from her grip, slamming it against the inner wall. A figure fell into the room. Then another. It was John Miller and his wife, Clara. They were unrecognizable. Their faces were masks of ice. Their eyes were frozen shut. They crawled onto the dirt floor, gasping, their lungs burned by the cold. Sarah threw her weight against the door, fighting the gale to close it. She dropped the bar. The silence returned. Miller rolled onto his back. He looked up at the ceiling, the weave of willow poles, the dark earth, the drying herbs hanging from the roots. He looked at the candle, burning steady and bright. He had lost his house. He had watched the roof tear off like a sheet of paper. He had grabbed his wife and run blindly into the white, aiming for the only other shape he knew was there. He looked at Sarah. The girl he had pitied. The girl he had mocked. He was shivering violently, the onset of hypothermia. Sarah didn't speak. She put a blanket over him. She poured a cup of hot water. It doesn't move, Miller stammered, his teeth clacking. The walls, they don't move. No, Sarah said. The wind has nothing to catch. They sat there for 18 hours while the storm raged. The man who believed in lumber and the girl who believed in dirt. The expert and the outcast. Inside the square, they would have died. Inside the circle, they drank tea. The storm broke the next afternoon. The sun came out, blindingly bright on the new snow. They opened the door. The world had been scrubbed. The drifts were 15 feet high in places. They looked toward the Miller claim. There was nothing. A foundation of scattered boards, a stovepipe sticking out of a drift. The house hadn't just collapsed. It had been erased. Miller wept, not for the wood, but for the realization of how close he had come to the end. Sarah looked at her round house. There was a long drift behind it, like the wake of a ship. But the roof was intact. The walls were solid. It hadn't lost a single brick. In the weeks that followed, the narrative changed. The surveyor came back. He didn't lecture this time. He walked around the house, measuring the snowdrift, calculating the aerodynamics. He wrote in his notebook, "Curvilinear structures exhibit superior aeroelastic response in high-velocity wind events." He meant the girl was right. Mrs. Gable came back. She brought a basket of bread. She didn't talk about propriety. She didn't talk about living like animals. She sat on a crate in the warm, round room, and she asked Sarah how she wove the roof. The mechanism, the aerodynamic circle and the thermal mass, had proven itself not in a debate, but in a crisis. Other settlers began to copy it. They didn't build round houses. Old habits die hard. But they started building round barns. They started building storm shelters with curved roofs. They started banking sod against their north walls. Sarah Kowalsski lived in that roundhouse for 12 years. She eventually married, not the old widower, but a young man who didn't mind that she knew more about construction than he did. They built a timber house eventually, but they kept the round cabin. They used it for storage. And every time the sky turned that bruised purple color, every time the wind picked up, they went back to the circle, because they knew the truth. Legacy. We live in a world of squares. We live in boxes. We trust the standard, the certified, the approved. But when the storm comes, whether it is a blizzard, an economic collapse, or a crisis of any kind, the square often fails. It is too rigid. It fights too hard. The forgotten wisdom of the roundhouse is this: do not fight the force. Deflect it. Build your life, your home, and your skills so that when the trouble hits, it slips past you. Be the stone in the river, not the bank. History is written by the survivors, and the survivors are the ones who are willing to look foolish to the experts in order to be safe from the storm. If you believe that practical intelligence is worth more than a degree, and you want to uncover more lost survival technologies, subscribe to this channel. We are digging up the past to prepare for the future.